Okay, those of you who attended LINX 108 in February will have seen me present. Remember real meetings? My God, we actually had to go and turn up together in the same building. You will have seen me present on 5G generally. I had the unfortunate slot just before the drinks, and I've been asked to come back and present on 5G and enterprise specifically. Now, of course, 5G's value adds are principally focused on enterprise. It's just that at the moment we're in a very consumer-focused phase. So this is really important aspect of 5G. I should point out that, like some others, I've had Zoom crash reports. In fact, an hour ago, my computer suddenly decided it wanted to restart. So I'm hoping that we will get through this in one piece. Technology is wonderful, isn't it? You don't need to take any screen grabs, by the way, because a slightly fuller version of this deck will be made available shortly thereafter, including tidying up any formatting quirks as it was translated from Google Docs into PowerPoint. Next slide, please, Holly. So 5G is well and truly with us. All four mobile network operators, or MNOs, have launched in the UK. Not every country that has 5G can say that each of its operators is launched. And indeed, lots of countries do not have 5G yet. So we are all familiar with each of the MNOs trumpeting how many more cities they're about to launch in and how many more large towns. And we're familiar with these sort of Kevin Bacon ads on TV. God bless Kevin Bacon. So it's great to be where we are. I think EU 5G population coverage is about 30% at the moment, which is not bad, to be honest. So 5G is still being rolled out with more to go. 4G also still being rolled out, of course, and about 90% of handsets out there are in fact 4G. At the moment, very few people currently have 5G handsets, and they tend, of course, to be high-end ones. So if you look at the what I've got here on the left, I've got three columns of risk factors that MNOs have had prior to 2020. The first one is that 5G costs a lot of money. And one could also add to that the fact that 5G is yet to really identify any use cases that consumers are willing to pay extra for. Brexit still rumbles on. It's largely taken a bit of a backseat because of obviously the pandemic, but the fact is we are 2 months away and we still don't quite know what the implications of that are going to be. The reason I mention Eastern European labour, by the way, in case you're wondering, is because 5G is a fibre network with radios on the end, and 5G goes where fibre goes. And fibre is open reach aside, largely done by Eastern European labour, who, if they didn't go home when the Brexit votes came in, many of them did go home when lockdown turned up earlier this year. So that is actually a real implication for the altnets or open reach competitors, if you will. Climate change still with us, just no one has time to talk about it at the moment. This year has basically introduced or highlighted three new risks for MNOs. One is high-risk vendors. I would actually suggest that that is probably less about Huawei, which is probably the most scrutinized equipment vendor that there is. It's actually more about the risk to UK PLC of resilience of 5G. And I think there's a sort of late awakening by many when they suddenly thought, you know what, if this 5G is half as important as equipment vendors and MNOs say it's going to be, looking forward to Industry 4.0, we better make sure that the networks are damn resilient. So there's been a lot of scrutiny in the networks. Huawei, as we know, slight issue, pulling that out, diverting CapEx from driving coverage. This has created duopoly, which is not a great place to be for the most important pieces of kit in a 5G network. DCMS is busy wandering around looking at how to increase vendor diversity with that, and is praying that Open RAN takes off. I have to say, I'm slightly skeptical about Open RAN. I don't think that's an easy integration. And also, there is an interesting aspect around Open RAN and resilience, and that is if you bring into UK public networks kit from companies that the MNOs and the National Cybersecurity Centre have no real knowledge of how they work and how the software that controls them work, that seems to have an interesting resilient aspect all of its own. And the two other risk factors, of course, are COVID, which is still rumbling on, as we know, and also 5G conspiracy theories and the related ICNIRP exclusion zones. Several masts burned down earlier this year. I'm not sure 5G was on any of them, but that's not a great sort of backdrop. Next slide, please. So a quote here from the guy who runs Be the Business. Now, for those who don't know what Be the Business is, it's a public-private organization which produced a really interesting report a couple of months back, I think it was September, principally focusing on SMEs and looking at technology adoption by SMEs and what are the barriers and how do you address it. But I think it's succinct for general application actually, because what he's saying is, this pandemic has shocked firms of whatever size, and they've had to advance technology plans. They're starting to see technology as something that's absolutely essential contingency in times of great disruption. So COVID has sort of become a tragic catalyst, which has brought forwards investment in new technology, which otherwise probably would have been made, but further down the line. So we have seen manufacturers overcome their usual reluctance to having their data taken off-prem. In fact, they've had to rely on data being uploaded to public cloud so that they can have remote employees access it. We've seen an awful lot of interest in IoT. Now, IoT is one of those things that's been rumbling on for years. There's a huge boost in interest in enterprise IoT. So this is all really, really good, albeit for the most tragic of reasons. Of course, consumers have also had a massive acceleration of various digital trends which have been ongoing. So the huge jump in online groceries and other sales that we've seen, even as shops have reopened, they're now of course preparing to close again, but even as they reopened, it's settled back at a much higher level than was the case before, which has really challenged those retailers that didn't have much in the way of online presence and suitable logistics. And indeed, some of the big fast-moving consumer groups, companies, which have really, they didn't have a B2C offering and didn't want to. They actually, if you tried to order from their websites, it was all about pushing you to their retailers. They didn't want to compete with downstream. And now, of course, they've had a situation where those retailers have been closed for months. So lots of people rethinking technology and how they might advance it. Industry 4.0, well, I've long thought that 5G was a sort of golden thread that will hold all the elements of that together. Industry 4.0, far from being something that is years away, with all the then public policy issues that will result from that as we start to look at what work means and how you need to retrain people and move people around the country, because the new jobs are not going to be created exactly where the old ones are destroyed. Industry 4.0 is actually something that is now on the horizon. You can see it, and I would argue in China, it's actually already started. They actually genuinely have smart ports and smart hospitals in a way that we don't yet. Next slide, please. So I'm going to highlight just a few things which have been accelerated, or for some people, like the current Zoom boom, and here we are all sitting on Zoom, are new for millions of users, because they've got direct connectivity implications. So all of us have suddenly got used to having loads and loads of remote meetings with different tools. Zoom and Teams may sort of dominate it, but there's a whole bunch of new stuff, some of which was rushed out in beta to take advantage. And those of you who had the misfortune to log on to a webinar using one of these new tools sometimes found they didn't quite work the way you expected. So what is this going to do for connectivity? Well, obviously, it's great that people realize the value of digital connectivity and how you can work from home. That's a fabulous place to be. Zoom itself and Teams also doesn't actually need a huge amount of speed, and it doesn't really need low latency. But for those who've got the absolute worst connectivity, that is kind of exposed on group calls, especially when they have to come off, take their video back online because they've got to ask someone something. Then if you've got a really crap connection, that does get exposed. So I would suggest those who've got the worst tiers, maybe finding ways of upgrading those tiers. And it is worth bearing in mind that often when you see these Ofcom comparisons looking at how good or otherwise people's connectivity is, what they generally are looking at is not what connectivity you could have, but what you've actually got. There's an awful lot of people who have faster tiers they could upgrade to, but actually so far haven't seen a reason to do so. So I don't see Zoom and Teams driving fiber or 5G adoption, but it's great that it reinforces the value of having that digital connectivity. Next slide, please. Okay, so broadcast substitution by IP. We are all watching a lot more TV, however you define it, and a greater proportion of that larger pie is actually delivered over IP. This is a trend that's been going on for a long time, but it has really, really been accelerated. I think Disney Plus could not have had a better time to launch in this country than in March, and what we've seen is the as broadcasting viewing has continued to decline and the IP is coming at a much higher level. For those who are wondering, looking at the table at the bottom right, why Amazon Prime Video seems to have grabbed so much, it's worth bearing in mind that unlike the other three services listed there, you do not actually subscribe directly to Amazon Prime Video. What you do is subscribe to Amazon Prime, and a lot of people, as they've expanded the range of things that they buy online during lockdown earlier this year, found it very, very useful to subscribe to Amazon Prime, and they got the video with it. So there's been a huge uplift on that. Puts people like ITV in a really, really difficult position. Yes, Baby Yoda, someone's just said at the bottom there. It puts ITV in a really difficult position as companies cut discretionary spending, and therefore ad rates on ad-funded broadcasters have had to decline. They've seen the online subscription VOD competitors really taking a lot of their viewership. Will it drive uptake on media in the end? Well, 5 megs for HD is not going to challenge an awful lot of competitors, a lot of connections, and I would suggest the latency doesn't require fiber or 5G yet. But I have to say, speaking personally, if you are streaming ultra high definition in peak and you don't have fiber, you quite often will find buffering. So I think this may trigger some people to upgrade or need to be more receptive when a fiber provider knocks on the door than they otherwise would have been. Next slide, please. Now, gaming is a really interesting one because this rarely gets quoted by ministers or Ofcom or analysts as a use of digital connectivity, but by God, is it ever? It is a huge business. And while the popular view of non-gamers that it's all about spotty teenage boys is actually not true and hasn't been true for a long time. Most gamers are casual gamers. Most gamers are actually women. And it's not spotty teenage boys. And I tell you what, the amount these people spend is astronomical. Even if they're not into tricked out Alienware desktops, the amount they spend is phenomenal. And if you have, if you're a technology provider into the gaming industry, you really have to hone your product to satisfy hardcore gamers. So it's no great surprise that NVIDIA's GPUs are being used in servers and under the hoods of autonomous vehicles. It's also no great surprise that some of the gaming engines which are used to render the backgrounds and the games you're using actually have wider applicability. So someone referenced Baby Yoda on chat. If you watch The Mandalorian, the backgrounds are rendered by a games engine, not by technology which has been developed with TV or movie business in mind. A couple of years ago, that would not have been the case. Now, in gaming, the really interesting thing from the point of view of driving connectivity is the extent to which the increased time that people are spending on games translates into increased interest in cloud gaming. This is relatively new. We've had Google Stadia, Apple Arcade, Facebook's got renewed interest in gaming. Cloud gaming hasn't really taken off yet, but there's plenty to play for. If you look at that little image on the bottom right hand of the screen, you will see that gaming stands out as the anomaly, if you will, compared to music and video. In fact, interestingly, on the video, when I used to work for the BBC and we were developing what became iPlayer, the view at the time was, of BBC's new media department, that people would download, that they would choose a program they wanted to watch, they would book it for download, it would download overnight, and they watch it the next day. And of course, that is absolutely not what people want to do. They want stuff now, they want it streamed. If that translates into a big uptick in cloud gaming, that will drive connectivity and low latency connections. There is also some interesting research which shows an interest amongst hardcore gamers in having a 5G and games bundle, which presumably is a games-focused MVNO opportunity waiting to happen. Next slide, please. So, working from home, networks coped. Well, of course they did. I can almost hear Neil McRae say. But the reality is, if you go back to March when lockdown came in, there was a lot of angst in DCMS and in Ofcom and amongst journalists that the networks would not cope with mass working from home. Well, you know what? They did. They coped with some massive games downloads and upgrades, and working from home didn't kill the networks. They didn't fall over. They continued to work. On the one hand, you could say, well, doesn't that kind of cut the legs out underneath demand for fiber? I'm a more positive, more glass half full kind of person. I think what this does is that, so yes, I can see Neil's comment there. Yes, everyone's a technology expert, aren't they? I think what this has done is it's reinforced the desirability, again, of digital connectivity and good enough digital connectivity. And as time goes on, the level of what we regard as being good enough sort of increases, which is a good place to be in. I've also had discussions with people who think that when we start working from home less, that the Zoom boom will translate into strain on mobile networks as people are out of both the home and the office. I have to say, I'm not sure that's true, because generally speaking, you don't use Zoom in a truly mobile sense. You use it nomadically. So if you're not at home and you're not in the office, you're in Costa Coffee and you're on their Wi-Fi. So I don't really see a real problem with that. Next slide, please. So consumer confidence, why does this matter if we're talking about enterprise? It kind of matters because the current 5G we've got deployed by the MNOs is a consumer proposition. So consumer take-up of handsets, consumer usage of 5G matters to justify ongoing investment in those networks. Not all enterprises want private networks. Some of those who do recognize they might need a hybrid solution, although no one's managed to work out what roaming between public and private quite means at the moment. You also have to bear in mind that when you're selling technology into businesses, whether you're talking to ops or IT or whatever, you're selling to people who are consumers first and foremost. So if a technology you're coming with under your arm and saying this is what you need is actually being perceived widely as having been a consumer flop, that colors the way it is seen. So think Google Glass, for example, which I think has some really interesting enterprise applications, but everyone you talk to about it automatically thinks of the fact that it was a consumer flop first. So consumer confidence is important. It's worth bearing in mind, though, that although it is coming back generally, certain sectors, broadly speaking, the young, the poorer households and the unskilled, they're still very much in COVID gloom territory. Next slide, please. Okay, so 5G's here, 5G's being rolled out, that's great. What is the promise of 5G? Well, I nicked a credit here from NEC on the right. I could have nicked any, to be honest. We're all familiar with lots of wonderful images, which invariably show some wonderful Blade Runner-ish city like Shanghai at night, on which people have superimposed lots of radio waves and lines and a big 5G, and this one doesn't really vary too much from that. So 5G is here, and apparently it's going to deliver lots of wonderful, whizzy new things. Well, it kind of might do, although it's not really doing so at the moment. We've had lots of test beds and trials. The emphasis now in the 5G test beds and trials program that DCMS runs until it winds up at the end of 2022 is to now sort of moving away from wow, isn't that amazing from an academic point of view, into, okay, what are the real world sustainable uses that we can make of this? Less about research and innovation and more about real applicability for consumers and enterprise. I welcome that. Next slide, please. So if we have a quick recap of some of these sort of jets and future that we've had promised in successive Mobile World Congresses, you know, remote robotic surgery, great. Untethered VR, very early days for VR, or indeed for mobile AR, truly out of the home, very, very early days. If you do take off, yeah, you are going to need fast connections, and you're going to need low latency, because if you're doing on VR, and you've got higher than 13 milliseconds, you're going to be seasick. You'll not only spend a lot of money on the kit, look a bit of an idiot, you'll be seasick at the same time. Not a great combination. Autonomous vehicles are taking longer to arrive than anyone expected. There's been a lot about 5G and autonomous vehicles. There was an interesting analysis from the guy who headed Google's Waymo division a year or so ago, when he said the last 10% is going to be harder than the first 90%. And I think he's absolutely right. What I'm pretty sure on is that they are never, ever going to rely on public networks to make crucial decisions like, do I turn here, do I stop here? But for vehicle-to-vehicle communications, 5G may well be the technology that is adopted, although there's a bit of a VHS versus beta format war going on at the moment. So that kind of Jetsons future is a way off. Okay, so what are we actually going to use 5G for? Next slide, please. Here we go. Now, before Neil McRae jumps in and says, oh, I recognize that picture, I have credited you, Neil. It is indeed a picture from you. It's a very impressive figure. 870 megs. It's worth bearing in mind that, of course, when you're talking about mobile networks, the speed you get does very much depend, are you mobile or stationary, and how many other people have got those latest devices in your cell and are sharing your bandwidth. But nonetheless, it's a very impressive figure. I don't really know what you'd use it for. I have to say 5G's marketing at the moment seems to be focused on how quickly you can download movies, which always makes me slightly giggle. We've got Hollywood, whose movies are getting longer and longer, sort of 2.5, verging 3 hours now, twice what cinema owners really want them to be. And I have to say, unlike podcasts, where there are people who listen to them at 1.5 times, I've never met anyone who watches a movie at anything other than normal speed. But anyway, it's a nice picture. Thank you, Neil, for that one. Next slide, please. So if you really care about how fast 5G is, might be worth looking at sort of real world averages and perhaps comparing with 4G, because the relativity rather than the absolute might be the thing that matters more to you when considering an upgrade. So here we have an international league table, the sort of thing ministers love, or they do if their country comes to the right end of that table. Now, you could look at that and say, well, the UK is not doing really very well. There are loads of countries which have got faster connections. Well, maybe. I'm not sure they know what to do with them yet, though. I think the important thing for that is that it looks like 5G is offering about 6 times what 4G is offering on speed. So if use cases emerge needing speed, 5G does offer a real step up. Yes, of course, the more people have 5G handsets and are sharing your cell, the more you would expect the speed you get to go down. Then again, though, there is more spectrum to be layered in to support that 5G connection. So all in all, I think 6 times is a pretty good place to be. However, worth bearing in mind, the research does repeatedly show that people want more 4G connectivity rather than more 5G. Next slide, please. Okay, so 5G's got a tough business case. People aren't paying any more for it. We don't know what the new revenue streams are, and it's complex. What we have at the moment is 5G, which operates in conjunction with 4G. If you actually look forward to the 5G future, which is cloud native, where changes that would have been made by humans and possibly even by someone going out in a van are actually now made by AI in a data center. If you're looking at something with edge compute, you are looking at something that's way more complicated than it did before. That not only has interesting resilience implications, it has cost implications. This costs money. So yet again, where is the money coming from that will justify the payment for this? Oh, that was interesting. Glad that wasn't my PC. Okay, slides will come back. Here we go. Right, okay. So what are we actually going to use it for and who's going to use it? Well, this is a nice version of the familiar 5G triangle, which basically says 5G does 3 things. It delivers you faster 4G, which is the obvious consumer marketing bit. It delivers you lots of really, really low latency communications to control robotics, with particularly in proximity to humans, and massive machine-to-machine communication, so 1 million things per square kilometer, which outside of Felixstowe and smart cities, it's hard to see too many applications for, certainly not in the consumer space. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Holly. Thank you. Okay, so you might think, well, if there's lots of enterprise applications for this, then there must be big numbers attached to what deploying 5G will do. And there are big numbers. Every analyst worth their salt has produced big numbers, and the time that they expect these big numbers to arrive is always so far in the future that they're never going to be held to account. I've actually borrowed this not from an analyst, but from Qualcomm, but yes, it's got a big number in the bottom left, and it's 2035. I think the important thing is not whether or not the number will turn up, but to see some of the numbers attributed by Qualcomm to particular sectors. And if there are design purists in the audience, I do apologize, I've annotated this because I think there are things worth pointing out here, and that is that those 3 sectors that I put a red hashed line around, they are public services in the UK. And that matters because if your customer or prospect enters in public service, then you've got a whole bunch of other considerations that come in. How much money have they generally got? Connected smart cities, for example, requires local government to be buying stuff from you. They haven't had any money since 2010 when the coalition came in. So how much money have they got? There's always a political lens that these things are run through. As a former Treasury official, I can tell you that the principal objective of a civil servant is not to do the right thing, is to avoid doing the wrong thing, and that doesn't always produce the same results. You also have to bear in mind that there are public procurements, possibly state aids issues, and if you're in a regulated sector, you've got an additional overlay as well. Connected healthcare, I think, is the one that, thanks to what's going on at the moment, is most likely to benefit from 5G. So if you think about the Liverpool 5G testbed, which was health focused. Actually, most of that was focused not on health, but on social care. In Scotland and Wales, they're quite interconnected. In England, they still aren't. I think COVID will change that. So actually, it's much more about how you use digital connectivity, essentially to produce predictive maintenance for human bodies in their homes and in homes. And that is much more about long time series analysis of data. It's much more akin to a smart meter. It doesn't need big packets of data. It doesn't really need ultra low latency. It's about machines monitoring people who have long-term health conditions, because these are people who disproportionately clog up primary care or GP surgeries. And it's about letting them stay at home and send data in to be analyzed somewhere else. And if there's anomalies, a doctor might want a video consult with you. It's not really about a piece of equipment in your home which tells you you need to go to ER, I've called an ambulance, and you need to pack your pajamas and your toothbrush. It's not really about that at all. But technology has a huge role if we integrate health and care in England, and actually doing that, being an enabler for essentially transitioning our investment, our huge investment in health, away from cure and towards prevention. Next slide, please. Okay, so the bells and whistles for enterprise are largely not yet here. So release 16 is the next release to come in. It is about a year away from being commercialized, I would suggest. That is being referred to in some quarters as full 5G. I think that's a rather dangerous term to use, but it's regarded essentially as the release of the 3GPP specification, which allows a lot of the bells and whistles that enterprise have been looking for to genuinely arrive in an optimized way. So enhanced network slicing turns up. Yeah, you can do network slicing in 4G, but it really flies with release 16. You can also, of course, bundle together different spectrum bands in 4G, but 5G is what really delivers on that. So the bells and whistles will come in over the next couple of years. Next slide, please. Okay, it's worth looking at some of those specific sectors or verticals, as MNOs insist on calling them. Again, I've annotated an existing slide. Here's one I borrowed from the Italian operator, Tim. If you look down the left-hand side, I've annotated it in red with some external factors that affect CapEx. Because if you were going in to see a public sector body, if you were going in to see a body that is regulated, that is, it's got a sectoral regulator, then you need to bear in mind it's not all about ROI or health and safety. There are extra considerations that need to be brought into play here. So, for example, in energy, the big thing from a CapEx point of view that has always been talked about for at least 10 years is the smart grid. Well, the smart grid is not going to happen until those energy companies seek agreement from, obtain agreement from Ofgem, and their regulatory asset base can reflect that investment and they can recover that from their customers. Similarly, if you're doing anything to do with health or mobility, you have got regulators who are going to be very interested in your plans, and it is worth bearing that in mind. So some of those sectors who have big contributions to GDP, if they adopt 5G, and the earlier they adopt it, the better, they have these external considerations to bear in mind before they sign on the dotted line. Next slide, please. Okay, here's another interesting analysis of where it is thought that people will actually gain the greatest advantage from using 5G. I'm not surprised that automotive comes up at the top. Manufacturing and logistics kind of make the most sense for early adopters. Logistics, I'm including container ports in this, not least because they're both private sector operations, or at least they are in this country. They don't have sectoral regulators. They actually can look at ROI and health and safety. Logistics, particularly ports, is a particular interesting angle from the point of view of Brexit, because there's a lot more interest in tracking stuff that comes into the country. What's on the manifest, whose is it, where is it going? Automotive, interesting, because obviously that produces lots of photo ops. People get automotive. You know, you stand a minister in front of a mini production line in Oxford, they understand what's going on. Stick them in a room filled with guys huddled over MacBook Pros, writing the next book of Grand Theft Auto, and they have a clue what's going on. So automotive is a particular resonance with ministers, as it does with the CBI and its mirror image, the TUC. It's worth bearing in mind also what I put on the bottom left, on the left there, the SMEs have specific barriers. About 90% of manufacturing companies in this country are SMEs. There are specific barriers to tech adoption by SMEs. Next slide, please. Oh, and as if I wrote it myself. SMEs have specific barriers. They sure do. SMEs generally speaking, don't have chief technology officers, chief digital officers. They usually don't have an IT team. They're not looking for bespoke solutions, but they do want vendors to understand what's unique about them and to not just try and sell them something that they previously sold to bigger companies. They need solutions which come in a box and just work without endless hand-holding from IT departments that they don't have. There's also a huge amount of distrust in SMEs when it comes to technology vendors. They don't trust them, they don't think they sell to SMEs, and they're probably largely right. So there is a real issue there. If this can be cracked by technology vendors to get SMEs to adopt 5G, that would be absolutely fantastic. Next slide, please. So here are a couple of slides on the right, which I nicked from that Be the Business report, which I do encourage you to have a look at. SMEs, say, they have a history of not particularly adopting technology all that well. If you speak to the Federation of Small Business, they fully understand that, but as they themselves don't get tech out, I mean, it doesn't make for an easy sell. SMEs struggle with today's technologies. If you look at some of the collaboration software, the Huddles and Sacks of this world, they're really not using those, far less looking at 5G, which is essentially tomorrow's technology. So there is a real opportunity here for selling 5G into these guys. Let's hope that it can be grabbed by probably the MNOs, because these guys are not going to be having private networks. Next slide, please. Okay, private networks. Here is the picture. This one borrowed from Qualcomm. It looks like Felixstowe, Rotterdam. Essentially, there's a lot of interest in private networks. No great surprise. The MNOs are looking at it with a degree of fear because they think most of the contracts to run these networks will go somewhere else. I think they're probably right. The range of things that you can do if you have a network that you've optimized for your own use cases rather than a network that was actually built to satisfy consumer handsets is quite enormous. And of course, there's always that concern about security of data. Can we keep it on-prem? What's the failover? How do we ensure that we have fallback if something goes down unless we've had it designed specifically for our locale? So a lot of interest in private networks and who might be running them. Next slide, please. So who might be running them indeed? So there's a lot of discussion, as I say. If you're an MNO, you view this with sort of mixed feelings, to be honest. I think MNOs actually have a lot of value that they can bring here. They understand how to run the cellular technology. They've been doing it for decades. They know how to run it as carrier grade. They've got network operations centers. They have people who know the kit. They know the software that the kit runs on. They can help the providers to debug it when things go wrong. They have enormous amounts of expertise. What they generally don't have is sales channels into the customers. They may have people who sell airtime and maybe handsets, but that is a procurement issue. It's not really an ops issue. On the other hand, if you're a key supplier to a sector, if you're an SI like Fujitsu or maybe a consultancy like CGI, you probably do know a bit more about the individual customer, what their pain points are, what their cultures are, what their risk appetite is, and this stuff really, really matters. So if you're NHSX and when this pandemic is gone, you decide you really want to have a 5G private network in a hospital, you want to have a wireless hospital, the likelihood is that the NHS are going to turn to someone on its already approved supplier list. The likelihood is they're going to turn to Atos rather than Vodafone, to be honest. But I have to say, I think MNOs have a lot to bring as well, and there'll be a lot of enterprises that aren't looking for private provision. There'll also be some that are looking for hybrid. As with cloud, the answer is not private or public. For them, it'll be hybrid. How that works, I don't know, but it has to involve MNOs. So MNOs definitely have a key role to play here. Next slide, please. And conclusions, I'm not sure I quite made it in the time, I didn't quite, but anyway, we have this fascinating, although traumatic digital transformation piece that's going on at the moment in enterprise. We have time before a lot of those bells and whistles turn up for enterprise to be engaged. Just remember, they are usually not looking for revolution. They want evolution. They want something that reduces equipment downtime, that helps health and safety, that takes wires out of factory. That's a good health and safety reason to use 5G. They want something that they can understand, they can sell to their board, that doesn't require extensive upskilling or retraining or becomes an internal comms issue. They want something that just layers improvements on what they already do. And SMEs need special attention, and it may be that public intervention is the way to deliver that if SMEs need what they regard as independent or trusted advice. I have previously suggested when I was still at Tech UK that what the government probably needs is something like an office for digital business with an SME focus on this. I still think that's probably a really good thing to have because vendors really are not trusted by these guys. But there's a massive opportunity here for 5G, both MNOs and the SIs and the suppliers, and in some cases in partnership. It's going to be a massive transformation. The one upside, as I say, if you're a technology provider of COVID, is precisely the fact that you have accelerated by several years conversations that you were probably going to have with enterprise. That is the one good thing that's come out of this. And that's the end for me. Thank you very much.